Hello, St. Michael's family, and greetings from the chilly confines of far north Dallas. This is Reverend Eric Liles coming to you as we continue to engage in our story, our second of 3-year commitment for adult formation as we explore the Anglican footstool of Scripture, tradition, and reason. We have been away from each other for quite a few weeks. I think we have to go all the way back to February 16th to have our last sort of class on the history and tradition and theology of the Christian Church. When we talked about the English Reformation, we had a couple sessions after that. But it has been a while since we've been together in St. Michael's Chapel and walked through our story together. I want to encourage all of you, particularly if you watch this video and you can't remember that far back, or you've never participated in God's story or our story. There's some incredible video resources for God's story as we read through the whole Bible last year. Lots of video presentations as we walk through the whole narrative of God's story together. And then there are some great audio recordings of the classes that we've had during this year as we've journeyed through our story. So we're calling it God's story, our story, and then next year will be my story, Scripture, tradition, and reason. Today, we are going to walk through some of the historical and theological insights of a particular period in time. That's the period between the English Reformation and the American Revolution. And I have a confession to make, and that is I am the least qualified person in the world to talk about this particular topic. So just a quick story about why I'm the least qualified person to talk about this particular topic. In seminary, we had 3 different quarters of church history 1, 2, and 3. And traditionally, you would take church history 1 and 2 in the fall and then come right back and right after the Jan term, take church history 3. I really took a lot of classes on theology in seminary, and so I did not take church history 3 my first year of seminary. Nor did I pick it up in my second year of seminary. And so when our rector came to Virginia Seminary, they had their church history class at a different day and time, and I had signed up for a particular commitment that could only meet at one time, and so the whole seminary had to move when church history 3 was because I had been avoiding it for so long. So that tells you a little bit about my own particular interest and expertise in this particular period of church history. But we're going to do our best. And as I mentioned, there's some important topics and theological issues to kind of talk through as we consider this period of time between the English Reformation and the American Revolution. So just as a reminder of what's going on in world history during these centuries, of course, this class we're roughly calling Empire and Colonies. And you'll remember that the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French are in the business of expanding their empires and colonizing different parts of the New World, in particular in an effort to acquire gold and wealth, but also from a religious perspective, these Roman Catholic countries are expanding Catholicism in the New World in some significant ways. Of course, in England, the English Reformation has happened. And as a consequence of that, we have debates and disagreements about how Catholic the church should be, how Protestant the church should be, how to be one church that's divided, and then eventually we will see different groups begin to split off after the Reformation generally, and then even after the English Reformation. And in England itself, there is a whole period of time where there is this impetus for purity of faith, as Martin Luther in the Reformation noted, getting away from indulgences, getting away from works righteousness, getting back to the purity of being saved by grace alone and the Scriptures and the Bible, and away from some of the fancy worship that existed in not only the Roman Catholic Church, but of course in the Church of England as well. Virginia, the state, is going to be a major player, of course, during this period of time as we talk about the Church of England and the precursor to the Episcopal Church, of course, the Anglican Church as it begins to exist. There were efforts before this, but 1607 is the founding of Jamestown in Virginia. And as the English begin to colonize in the New World, they bring with them clergymen from England. Unfortunately, at the same time that this is happening, English colonies, in particular in the South and in the English Isles, begin to rely heavily on a sort of a plantation society, predominantly for the trade. There's no gold, but there's a lot of money to be made in agriculture, particularly tobacco and sugar. And so we see a plantation society get developed, and that plantation society is completely dependent upon enslaved people, mostly from Africa, who came and worked on those plantations. This is a very sad part of not only American history, but the history of the Church of England and the colonies, and even until we get much, much later after the American Revolution, a shameful part of our own church history in the Episcopal Church. As the colonies are being established, some of them are doing so to escape religious persecution. And during these centuries in England, there's a lot of back and forth. We can go back in the class on the English Reformation. Of course, we've got the different dynasties coming through, whoever is in charge, the kings and queens, and whether we're going to be Roman Catholic or Protestant. Eventually, we have the Elizabethan settlement, which sort of establishes the Church of England as this, I'm going to call pseudo-Protestant church, right? There's a joke about, it's a terrible joke, the only thing that Church of England was protesting in the Reformation, Protestant protesting, was marriage because of Henry, because he wanted a divorce. It's a terrible joke. Obviously, that's not entirely true, but there are some pieces of truth in that joke about our particular history as it dates back to the founding of the Church of England. But, things that were important to the Church of England were having a prayer book that in the native language that everybody could use. We did keep clergy and apostolic succession and some vestments and some things like that. And after a period of time, there were a group of people, because of the influences of the Reformation, who really wanted to do something different with their faith beliefs. And so quite a few of them came to the U.S., to the colonies, at different times for different reasons. We celebrate Thanksgiving as Americans, an annual reminder of the pilgrimage and the Mayflower, landing in Plymouth, founding the plantation. And we remember that a group called the Puritans came, sort of fleeing persecution, and other groups came as well. The interesting things about the group that comes to Plymouth in about 1620 is that, they're attempting to isolate themselves from the corrupt English religion, which is interesting to think about the church being that corrupt in England only 100 years or so after the Reformation. And they do not bring any clergy with them. And there are no clergy with the people of Plymouth for 9 years. And Eucharist is not one of their devotional priorities. Because of the different settlers, the different groups, Puritans, and we get some Quakers coming over, we get a heavily influenced group of Presbyterians coming over. The church in Scotland becomes Presbyterian, as opposed to being part of the Church of England. They sort of separate themselves, and we'll talk a little bit about that with Cromwell in a minute. But what I want to say about governance is, think about the Western Christian Church in terms of there's only one for 1,500 years, right? There's the Great Schism, which divides East from West in the 11th century. But up until the Reformation with Martin Luther, essentially there is one Western Christian Church. And then right after the Reformation, the chips begin to fall and more divisions begin to happen. And the Roman Catholic Church, the particular structure of the church, and its relationship to empire and to royalty and how countries were run, of course, are heavily influenced on how and who America comes to be later on. We don't have a monarch, and we don't have a state religion. Both of those things existed for centuries in countless countries around the world, and then heavily influenced empire and settlement in the New World as well. In the Roman Catholic Church, there's a pope. The pope is served by a bunch of cardinals who are in a particular level of leadership and hierarchy in the church. There are bishops, there are priests, deacons, catechists, lay people, and in a lot of ways it is seen as sort of a hierarchy. We, of course, in the Church of England and then the Episcopal Church, inherit some of those practices, but we also, particularly in the colonies, begin to recognize the importance of lay leadership within the church. And so vestries get developed, and eventually vestries are given the authority to call rectors. This all happens during this period of time. And that particular development happens because the Congregationalists have a particular way of being church, and that is by an individual congregation. And there are other groups which have a way of being church, like the Presbyterians, where leadership from lay and clergy gather together by a geographic distance. And so those are sort of three main different ways that the church can be structured in its organization and leadership and direction. So this is an important time in church history for the development of that. And then, of course, we will see how those three different structures carry out through the continuation of empire settling in the colonies. One of the major concerns in the New World about the Christian faith is about baptism. And in the Roman Catholic Church, infant baptism, and we looked at this in our class on religious art, infant baptism becomes normative. And in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Church of England, it's a normative practice as well. But as the Reformation begins to ask some questions about what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, do you have to be an adult who has a conversion experience? What are the requirements to belong to a church? All of those kinds of things. So a theological issue that really begins to arise out of this time is the question of infant baptism. The Puritans are going to say that there's a need for an adult conversion. Even if you are baptized into some Christian community, that to really be part of the Christian faith, that you need to have some sort of adult conversion experience. And I really liked this line that I read: Christian commonwealth is conceivable only if, as in ancient Israel, one becomes a member of it by birth. So as we talk about the colonies becoming a new world, a new country, potentially a Christian commonwealth, which is not exactly what we become, the idea is, like ancient Israel, you need to be born into the covenant, and so that infant baptism would be okay. And so with these questions of church governance and questions around infant baptism, there's a lot of tension. And then throw into the mix of that that we, the colonists, have enslaved people. And understanding that is really only, from their logic, possible because they don't believe that the humans are the same, or whatever misguided belief that they had back in the day. Baptism is a question in there as well, because if someone becomes baptized and they become a member of your Christian family, what does that do to your relationship with them if you are engaged in this plantation system? Also, Native Americans. There were people here in the colonies before the English and other settlers arrived, and we have a terrible history of that. There were a few clergy and others who really made some efforts. John Eliot, of course, and a lot of those people who really had a heart for the native population and for those who had come from Africa and a desire to free them did not come out of the Church of England, unfortunately. And so we have a difficult part of our history to sort of wrestle with here. A couple of thoughts that are interesting that kind of come out of this, and those of us who live in Texas know that the Baptist Church is extraordinarily strong here. In the olden days, in the early settlement times, there were really two different kind of Baptists, and I vaguely remember hearing these terms growing up, but I haven't heard them in a long time. And there's one that's called a general Baptist, which means that Jesus Christ died for all of humanity. And then there are particular Baptists. No, not John Smith down the street, who is a particular Baptist, but a particular Baptist is someone who believes that Jesus Christ died only for those who were predestined for heaven, for glory. And this comes out of Calvinism. It comes out of sort of an understanding of predestination and who's in and who's out and all those kinds of things. And so those things are in play as part of Protestant religion in this settlement. We also have Dutch Reformed folks in New York, of course. New York was originally a Dutch colony. And so there's quite a few different groups that are going on. 1734, the Great Awakening. This is one of the major important events that happens in the colonies, and is responsible in many ways for the modern landscape of Christianity in America today. So we have this pietistic movement in the Presbyterians, this movement towards purity and right living. We've got Jonathan Edwards, who's a Calvinist up at Yale, a Congregationalist, and we begin to talk about the importance of this personal experience of conversion as an adult. We begin to have these doubts about infant baptism. And we begin to have some preachers who are traveling, and up till this point, sermons had been very logical treatises on how we should use our intellect to worship and understand God. And now, here in the sort of second, third part of the 18th century, we begin to get preachers who are using emotions and are calling people, either through their words or how they're preaching, to feel faith, to feel the depths of their sin and their need for salvation, and the ecstatic release of experiencing conversion and those kinds of things. One of those preachers was Anglican named George Whitefield, and he was just a very zealous preacher. He preached all over the place, all of the time, and was very, very successful. He would draw huge crowds. 15,000 people would come to hear him preach. Can you imagine? So really, he's like the first American celebrity in a lot of ways. But there was this importance of, we got to take this faith thing seriously. And if you're going to be serious about your faith, then it requires some emotional work on your part as well. He wasn't necessarily an emotional preacher per se, but he definitely got an emotional response. And another one of the outcomes of the Great Awakening, Whitefield was good friends with John and Charles Wesley. And their efforts to come and be a holy club, a church club, the Methodists, was an attempt to sort of reform the Church of England from within, and then eventually becomes its kind of own deal. So the Great Awakening, 1740 to 76, is really, really crucial. After the Great Awakening, or as a consequence of it, the Southern Baptist Church eventually becomes the Southern Baptist Church, thrives, particularly in Georgia and beyond, and really starts to grow and swell. And this idea of adult personal conversion, kind of being all in the faith, becomes really important. One of the ironies during these centuries, of course, is that in 1619, when the first slaves are brought into the colonies, that just 20 years later, between the 1640 and 50s, on both sides of Atlantic, there's a real serious argument about sort of personal choice and freedom, and how to live your life. And out of the Great Awakening comes this idea that religious practice, like conversion, is really a matter of choice. And so, because of the Great Awakening and the groups that come out of that, there begins to be more focus on sharing the good news of Jesus with the enslaved people. And of course, it's going to be quite some time before slavery is abolished, but that beginning of Methodism and the Baptist Church are really consequential. In fact, in 1800, 1/5 of all American Methodists were enslaved people. And we have to deal with that history and that reality. So as we wrap up today, obviously there's lots of stuff that I skipped and missed. I meant to talk about Oliver Cromwell and sort of that whole thing that happened in England. But we did talk about the Puritans a little bit, and this is obviously not my forte, and nor is this particular format the easiest to engage in. I really miss being with you all and having an opportunity for dialogue and questions and to hear your knowledge and wisdom about all of this as well. But I'm glad that we will, over the next several weeks, close out our story. Next week, Father Chris is going to talk with us about the beginnings of the Episcopal Church. So right around the time of the American Revolution and the decades that follow as the Episcopal Church is sort of reconstituted out of not the ashes of the Church of England, but obviously when you have a revolution against a king and he's the one who's in charge of your church, you got some stuff to work through. And then the week after that, Father Greg's going to walk us through the 19th century and looking some more at Protestantism and what that means. And then I'll wrap us up at the end as we think about the 20th century and all the changes the world experienced in regards to the Christian faith. So I encourage you as much as you can just during this time that we're quarantined, that we're physically distancing ourselves from one another. If you're at home and you've got some time to engage in your own personal formation, I really just want to encourage you to read Scripture, to study church history and theology, to think about how your faith impacts everything in your life. I'm praying for you. I hope that you will continue to go through this process. I'm available. If you want to reach me, please send me an email. You can find my email on the church website. And there's so many resources there up right now and many more to come in the coming weeks. So be on the lookout for those. Good to be with you today. God bless you.